The parking lot lights flickered against the October wind, casting long shadows across the concrete as I held my son's hand tighter than I meant to. Jake was 7 years old, small for his age, with eyes that had always seemed older than they should be. Tonight, those eyes were wide with something I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but something deeper, more certain. The airport terminal glowed behind us, sterile and safe, while ahead lay the dark ribbon of highway that would take us back to our suburban neighborhood, back to our quiet street lined with oak trees and well-kept lawns, back to the house where we were supposed to sleep tonight. My husband Mark had just disappeared through the security checkpoint, his carry-on rolling behind him as he headed toward a 3-day business conference in Seattle. He'd waved one last time before turning the corner, his phone already pressed to his ear, already moving on to the next thing. That's when Jake had gone silent. Not the comfortable silence of a tired child ready for bed, but the kind of silence that fills up space like water, heavy and pressing. "Mom," he whispered as we reached the car, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the wind and the distant roar of jets overhead. "We can't go home tonight." I fumbled with my keys, distracted, already thinking about the drive, about whether I'd remembered to turn off the kitchen light, about the presentation I had to finish tomorrow. "Honey, we're going straight home. It's already past your bedtime." His grip on my hand tightened until it hurt. "Please, Mom. Please. We can't go home." Something in his tone made me stop. I crouched down to his level, searching his face in the sodium vapor glow of the parking lot lights. "Jake, what's wrong? Did something happen?" He shook his head, but his eyes were filling with tears. Not the dramatic tears of a tantrum or exhaustion, but the quiet kind that slip down without sound, the kind that come from somewhere real.
"I heard them," he said, "in the garage. Before we left."
They didn't know I came back for my jacket. My heart started beating faster, though I didn't know why yet. "Heard who, sweetheart?" "Grandpa Bill, and the other man. The one with the deep voice who comes sometimes when Dad's not home." Bill was my stepfather, my mother's second husband, a man who'd entered my life when I was 16 and had never quite felt like family despite 26 years of obligatory holiday dinners and forced pleasantries. He had keys to our house. I'd given them to him years ago when Mom had her surgery, back when I still believed in the fiction of blended families and mutual support. "What were they saying?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to plant fear in his imagination. Jake looked down at his sneakers, at the crack in the asphalt beneath them. They said, when are they leaving? And Grandpa Bill said any minute now, and the other man said good, and then Grandpa Bill said make sure nobody knows, and the other man laughed and said nobody ever knows until it's too late. The wind picked up, and I felt goosebumps rise on my arms that had nothing to do with the cold. "Jake, are you sure that's what they said?" He nodded, solemn and certain. "I'm sure, Mom. And when I went back inside to tell you, they stopped talking really fast, and Grandpa Bill looked at me weird. Then he smiled really big and asked if I was excited about the trip to the airport." I stood up slowly, my mind racing through explanations, through rational possibilities. Maybe Jake had misheard. Maybe it was taken out of context. Maybe Bill and whoever was with him were talking about something completely innocent, something my 7-year-old had filtered through the lens of too many Marvel movies and playground rumors. But then I thought about the way Bill had been lately. The questions about Mark's travel schedule. The unexpected visits when Mark was at work. The way he'd offer to help with our finances after I'd casually mentioned we were refinancing the house, his insistence on seeing our paperwork, his odd interest in the details of our insurance policies. My mother had died 2 years ago, and since then Bill had become different, more intrusive, more interested in my life than he'd ever been when she was alive. If you're watching this and you've ever had that gut feeling that something wasn't right, leave a comment below. Have you ever ignored it, or did you listen? Because what happened next would teach me that sometimes the smallest voice carries the most important warning. I made a decision in that parking lot that I still can't fully explain. Maybe it was mother's instinct. Maybe it was the memory of every true crime documentary I'd ever watched, every news story about the person who didn't trust their gut until it was too late. Maybe it was just that Jake had never, not once in his 7 years, lied to me about something serious. Okay, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We're not going home tonight. I saw the relief wash over his face like a wave, and that's when I knew, whatever he'd heard, whatever he'd sensed, it was real enough to have terrified him in a way he couldn't fully articulate. I buckled him into his booster seat, grabbed my phone, and started driving. Not toward home, but toward the interstate, toward the cluster of budget hotels and chain restaurants that surround every major airport. 20 minutes later, we were checking into a Comfort Inn, paying cash because some part of me, the part that was starting to understand the shape of danger, even if I couldn't see it clearly yet, knew that credit cards leave trails. The clerk barely looked up from her phone as she handed me the key cards to room 217. Jake fell asleep almost immediately, still in his clothes, curled up under the rough cotton sheets that smelled of industrial detergent. But I couldn't sleep. I sat in the darkness, watching him breathe, my phone clutched in my hand. That's when I remembered. 3 months ago, after a rash of break-ins in our neighborhood, Mark had installed a security camera system. Nothing elaborate, just 3 cameras, one on the front porch, one covering the driveway, and one inside, in the living room, positioned to see the front door and the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I'd thought it was overkill at the time, but Mark had insisted, and I'd eventually agreed. The app was still on my phone. I'd checked it maybe twice since installation, both times just to make sure it worked. Now, sitting in a motel room at 11:47 at night, I opened it with trembling fingers. The front porch camera showed our empty doorstep, illuminated by the motion sensor light we'd installed last spring. The driveway camera showed our house looking peaceful, ordinary, exactly as we'd left it 3 hours ago. I almost put the phone down, almost convinced myself that Jake had misunderstood, that I was being paranoid, that we could drive home right now, and everything would be fine. Then I switched to the interior camera. The living room was dark except for the glow of the digital clock on the cable box. For a long moment, nothing moved. I was about to close the app when I saw it, a flicker of light in the hallway, like someone passing with a flashlight, trying to stay quiet. My breath caught. I turned up the volume on my phone, pressing it close to my ear. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, the sound of someone trying not to make noise. Then voices, low and male, just barely audible over the ambient hum of our refrigerator and the distant sound of our neighbor's sprinkler system that always ran at midnight. Check the bedrooms, one voice said. I didn't recognize it. Already did. Nobody's here. This voice I knew.
Bill.
My stepfather. The man who'd walked me down the aisle at my wedding because my own father was already gone. The man whose Christmas gifts I'd wrapped for Jake, whose birthday I'd remembered with cards and phone calls, whose place at our Thanksgiving table I'd set every year for more than 2 decades. You sure they were supposed to be home? The first voice asked. That's what I told you. They dropped Mark at the airport at 8:30. Should have been back by 9. Something's wrong. There was a long pause, and I watched through the grainy night vision feed as 2 dark figures moved through my living room. One was shorter, stockier. Bill's silhouette was unmistakable. The other was taller, broader, wearing what looked like a black jacket and a baseball cap, pulled low. Maybe they went somewhere after, the tall man said. A movie or something. At 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night with a 7-year-old? She never does that. She's predictable. That's what makes this easy. The tall man moved closer to the camera, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of his face. I didn't know him. He was middle-aged, with a weathered face and dead eyes that reminded me of the men you see in police sketches, unremarkable and terrifying in their ordinariness. So what do? He asked. We wait. They'll come home eventually. They have to. Bill sat down on my couch, where Jake watched cartoons on Saturday mornings and where Mark and I had argued about paint colors and fallen asleep during movies. He sat there like he belonged, like he owned the place, and something in my chest cracked open with a feeling I'd never experienced before. Not quite rage, not quite fear, but something that tasted like betrayal distilled into its purest form. If you're still with me at this point, I need you to do something. Hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you gets even more unbelievable, and you're going to want to follow this story to the end. Trust me, you won't see what's coming. I sat there in that motel room for 3 hours, watching those men in my house, trying to understand what I was seeing. They made themselves comfortable. The tall man went to my kitchen and made coffee. Bill turned on the TV with the volume low, flipping through channels like he was waiting for a delayed flight. They talked occasionally, but not about anything that made sense: sports, weather, a restaurant they'd been to recently. Normal conversation. Except nothing about this was normal. At 2 in the morning, I finally worked up the courage to call the police. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely dial. The dispatcher sounded tired but professional. 911, what's your emergency? There are men in my house, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, terrified that somehow they might hear me through the phone, through the miles, through the walls. Men who broke in?
No.
They have keys. But they're not supposed to be there. My son and I were not home, but they're waiting for us. I could hear the skepticism in her voice, the subtle shift in tone that suggested she thought this might be a domestic dispute or a prank. Ma'am, do you know these individuals? One of them is my stepfather. And does your stepfather have permission to be in your home? He has keys, but he's not supposed to be there at 2 in the morning. Please, you don't understand. My son heard something. They're waiting for us. Something's wrong. The dispatcher took down my information, my address, told me to stay where I was. She said she'd send a unit to check on the residents. She made it sound routine, like a noise complaint or a false alarm. I watched through my phone as the police arrived 23 minutes later. 2 officers, young and professional, knocking on my front door at 2:30 in the morning. I watched Bill answer it, watched him smile and shake their hands, watched him gesture them inside with the casual confidence of someone who belonged. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see it. Bill's body language was relaxed, friendly, explanatory. He pointed at things, shrugged, smiled. The officers nodded. One of them laughed at something Bill said. The tall man had disappeared, probably out the back door the moment the police pulled up. After 10 minutes, the officers left. My phone rang almost immediately. The dispatcher. Ma'am, the officer spoke with William Patterson at the residence. He states that he's your stepfather and that he has permission to be there, that he's house-sitting while you and your husband are out of town. He seemed very cooperative and there were no signs of any disturbance. Is there some kind of misunderstanding? I felt like I was drowning, like the world had tilted, and I was the only one who noticed. He's not house-sitting. We're not out of town. My husband is, but I'm supposed to be home with my son. We only left because what? Because my 7-year-old had a bad feeling? Because I watched too many crime shows? Because a man who had every legal right to be in my house was sitting on my couch? Ma'am, if there's a family dispute, we can send someone to speak with you where you're staying, but there's no evidence of a crime in progress. Your stepfather has keys and claims he was asked to check on the house. Without evidence of forced entry or threatening behavior, there's not much we can do. She was kind but firm, and I understood. From her perspective, from anyone's perspective looking at the facts, this was nothing. A family miscommunication. An overreaction. But I had heard the audio. I had watched them wait, patient as spiders, in my living room. And I knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that if Jake and I had gone home that night, something terrible would have happened. I just didn't know what yet. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew the truth but couldn't prove it? Where reality and what people believe became two different things? Drop a comment. I need to know I'm not alone in this feeling, because the next 72 hours would test everything I thought I knew about trust and family. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I called Mark. He was in Seattle, in his hotel room, getting ready for the first day of his conference. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice rough with sleep. Babe, everything okay? I told him everything. Jake's warning, the motel, the camera feed, Bill sitting in our living room, the police visit. I expected shock, concern, immediate plans to fly home. What I got was silence. Finally, he spoke, careful and measured. Sarah, Bill is your stepfather. He has keys. Maybe he was just checking on things, and Jake misunderstood what he heard. Mark, there was another man. Someone I've never seen. They were waiting for us. For 3 hours? Sarah, doesn't it seem a little paranoid? Maybe Bill stopped by for something and brought a friend. Maybe they were watching TV and lost track of time. Jake heard them in the garage before we left. He heard them say, make sure nobody knows, and nobody ever knows until it's too late. What possible innocent explanation is there for that? Another pause. Longer this time. Kids misunderstand things. You know how Jake is, he's got an active imagination. And you've been stressed with work lately. Maybe you're reading too much into this. I felt something crack inside me, something I didn't even know was solid enough to break. You don't believe me. I believe that you believe it. But Sarah, you're talking about your stepfather. A man who's been in your life for decades. A man who's been asking a lot of questions about our finances lately. A man who's been showing up unannounced. A man who asked about your travel schedule last week. Because he cares about us. Because he's family. Jesus, Sarah, listen to yourself. You're accusing him of. What exactly? What do you think was going to happen? And that was the question, wasn't it? What did I think was going to happen? I didn't know. I just knew that the certainty I'd felt in that parking lot, the fear I'd seen in Jake's eyes, the patient waiting I'd witnessed on camera, it all added up to something dark, something that didn't fit into the comfortable narrative Mark was trying to construct. I'm not going home, I said quietly. Not until I figure this out. Sarah, you're being ridiculous. You're scaring Jake for no reason.
Just go home.
I'm sure Bill has a perfectly reasonable explanation. Then you call him. You ask him why he was in our house at 2 a.m.
Fine.
I will. And when he explains, you're going to feel pretty foolish about this whole thing. He hung up before I could respond. I sat there in the harsh morning light of the motel room, watching Jake sleep, and realized that I was completely alone in this. No one believed me. Not the police, not my husband, not anyone. Just me and a 7-year-old who'd overheard something he shouldn't have. But I had the camera footage. I had proof. I saved the recordings to my phone, backed them up to 3 different cloud services, emailed them to myself. Evidence. Undeniable, time-stamped evidence of Bill in my house in the middle of the night, of another man with him, of them waiting and talking about how we should have been home. It wasn't enough to prove intent, but it was enough to prove something was wrong. I started making calls. First to my bank, no unusual transactions, but I changed all the passwords anyway. Then to my insurance company, asking for copies of all our policies, suddenly paranoid about what I might find. The agent was cheerful and efficient, promising to email everything within 24 hours. Then I did something I'd never done before. I called Mark's office and asked to speak to his boss. I'm sorry to bother you, I said, trying to sound calm and rational, but I need to verify that Mark is actually at the Seattle conference. It's a personal matter. There was a confused pause. Mrs. Garrett, Mark didn't go to Seattle. The conference was canceled last week. I thought you knew. The floor dropped out from under me. Canceled? Yes, the venue had a fire safety issue. We sent out emails. Mark confirmed he got the notice. Is everything all right? I mumbled something about a miscommunication and hung up. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. Mark had left for a canceled conference. Mark, who I dropped at the airport just hours ago, who I'd watched walk through security, who I'd waved goodbye to as he disappeared toward a plane that apparently didn't exist. Drop a comment right now if you're following along, because this is where the story stops being about a random break-in and starts being about something so much darker. Where was my husband? Why had he lied? And what did Bill have to do with any of it? I called Mark back. It went straight to voicemail. I tried 3 more times. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. My mind was spinning, trying to find connections, trying to make sense of puzzle pieces that didn't fit together. Mark and Bill had always gotten along, better than Mark had gotten along with my actual father before he died. They went fishing sometimes, met for lunch, talked about sports and investments and things I never paid much attention to. But now I was paying attention. Now I was remembering the closed-door conversations in Mark's office that ended when I walked in. The texts that made Mark's face go carefully neutral before he deleted them. The way Bill had been at our house more and more frequently over the past 6 months, always when Mark was home. always with some excuse about helping with yard work or borrowing tools. I pulled out my laptop and started searching. Property records. Bill's name. Our address. It took me 45 minutes and 3 different county websites, but I found it. For months ago, there had been a quit-claim deed filed. I read it 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding. But the legal language was clear. Mark had transferred half ownership of our house, the house I thought we owned together, the house I'd put my inheritance from my father's death toward, the house where Jake had lived his entire life, to Bill. Half of our house now belonged to my stepfather. And I had never signed anything. I had never agreed. I had never even known. The pieces started falling into place like dominoes, each one clicking against the next with horrible inevitability. The life insurance policy Mark had increased last year, the one he'd said was just responsible planning for Jake's future. $2 million. With me as the primary beneficiary, but if I died, it went to Mark as Jake's guardian. The refinancing Bill had been so interested in, the paperwork he'd wanted to review, the questions about Mark's travel schedule, the increasing visits, the keys to our house. If something happened to me, an accident, a break-in gone wrong, anything plausible, Mark would get the insurance money. Bill would own half the house. And Mark, grieving husband that he'd be, could sell it, split the proceeds with Bill, and disappear into a comfortable life somewhere far away from the tragedy. But they needed me dead in my house, not in a motel room across town. They needed it to look random, opportunistic, the kind of terrible thing that happens sometimes in nice neighborhoods when someone forgets to lock a door or set an alarm. That's why Bill was waiting. That's why Mark had lied about Seattle. He was probably in some casino 2 states over, establishing an alibi, making sure he was visible and provably far away when the unthinkable happened. And Jake, sweet, observant Jake, who'd come back for his jacket at exactly the wrong moment. He'd heard them confirming the plan. If you're watching this, I want you to stop and think about the people in your life who have access to your home, your information, your trust. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because the rest of the story is going to show you exactly why you need to be more careful than you ever thought possible. I sat in that motel room for an hour, just breathing, just trying to process the scope of betrayal. My husband, my stepfather, working together to murder me. It sounded insane. It sounded like something from a movie, not something that happened to middle-aged women in suburban neighborhoods. But the evidence was there, spread across my laptop screen and saved on my phone. Evidence that told a story I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. I called the police again. A different dispatcher this time. I explained everything: the property deed, the insurance policy, the fake conference, the overnight visit, the cameras. I spoke slowly and clearly, trying not to sound hysterical, trying to present facts rather than fear. They sent a detective. Officer Maria Rodriguez arrived at the motel at noon, professional and skeptical in equal measure. She sat across from me in the cramped room while Jake watched cartoons with the volume turned up, oblivious to the adult conversation happening 5 feet away. I showed her everything. The camera footage, the property records, the email from Mark's boss confirming the canceled conference. I watched her face change as she reviewed it all, watched skepticism shift to concentration, watched her start taking notes with quick, efficient strokes. Mrs. Garrett, I'm going to be honest with you. What you have here is circumstantial. The property deed is legal. Your husband had the right to add someone to the title, even without your knowledge, depending on how the house was originally titled. The insurance policy is just a policy. The conference cancellation could be a miscommunication. Even the camera footage just shows your stepfather in your house, which isn't illegal if he has keys. My heart sank. But altogether, it's concerning. It's worth investigating. But it's not enough for an arrest. It's not even enough for a warrant. What I can do is make a report, document everything you've told me, and have a conversation with both your husband and your stepfather. But Mrs. Garrett, you need to understand. If they lawyer up, if they deny everything and claim this is a misunderstanding or a mental health crisis on your part, there's very little we can do without concrete evidence of a crime. What about attempted murder? What murder? Nothing happened. You're alive. Your son is fine. From a legal standpoint, no crime has been committed. Suspicious circumstances aren't criminal. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her and make her understand that just because something hadn't happened didn't mean it wasn't real, wasn't planned, wasn't seconds away from occurring if Jake hadn't heard what he heard. But I understood her position. She was a cop, not a mind reader. She dealt in facts, in evidence, in things that could be proven in court. And what I had was a ghost story, terrifying but intangible, built on coincidences and fears that might or might not be justified. So what do? I asked quietly. She leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. You do exactly what you're doing. You stay somewhere safe. You document everything. You don't go home until we've made contact with your husband and stepfather. And you consider getting a lawyer. A good one, someone who specializes in family law and possibly criminal defense, because if your suspicions are correct, this is going to get complicated very quickly. She left me her card and promised to follow up. I sat there for a long time after she left, watching Jake color in a cartoon character on the motel stationery, his small hands steady and sure, completely unaware that his casual observation in a parking lot had potentially saved both our lives. Mark called that evening. His voice was tight with forced patience. Sarah, I talked to Bill. He says you're having some kind of breakdown.
He's worried about you. I'm worried about you.
The police called me. Did you really tell them I'm trying to kill you? Do you know how insane that sounds? Why did you lie about Seattle? I asked calmly. There was a beat of silence. What? The conference was canceled. Your boss told me. So, where are you really, Mark? Another pause, longer this time. I could practically hear him recalibrating, trying to figure out how much I knew. I went to visit my brother. I didn't want you to be upset about using the money for a personal trip instead of work. Your brother who lives in Florida? The one you haven't spoken to in 3 years. We've been talking again, working on our relationship. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd judge me for spending money on. Stop lying to me, Mark. Just stop. I know about the property deed. I know Bill owns half our house. I know about the insurance policy increase. I know you weren't supposed to be in Seattle. So please, just tell me the truth. Why were you setting me up? If you're following this story, make sure you're subscribed because I'm about to tell you what happened next and it's going to make you question every relationship you think you understand. There was a long, long silence on the other end of the phone. When Mark finally spoke, his voice had changed. The forced patience was gone, replaced by something flat and cold that I'd never heard before. You should have gone home, Sarah. So you admit it. I admit that you've made this incredibly complicated. Bill was supposed to handle things quickly, painlessly. You weren't supposed to know, weren't supposed to suffer. Now you're going to drag this out, involve lawyers and cops and make everything messy. Messy? You were going to have me murdered and you're worried about it being messy? Murdered is such a dramatic word. It was going to be an accident. A break-in. You would have fought back, you're brave like that, everyone knows it, and things would have gotten out of hand. Jake would have hidden, traumatized but alive. I would have come home to tragedy. We'd have grieved together. He'd have eventually healed, kids do. And we'd have moved on with our lives.
We?
You and Bill. Bill invested money I borrowed for my business. Money I couldn't pay back. He had a solution. We transfer him half the house, increase your insurance, and everyone comes out ahead. The house gets sold, he gets his money, I get a fresh start, and you wouldn't have to deal with any of it. It was actually merciful if you think about it. I felt bile rising in my throat. You're talking about murdering me like it's a business transaction. Because that's what it was. Nothing personal, Sarah. You're not a bad person. You're just worth more to me dead than alive. He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was explaining why he preferred one brand of coffee over another. I realized in that moment that I'd never really known my husband at all. I'd been married to a stranger for 9 years, sharing a bed with someone capable of calculating the value of my death, like an actuary reviewing statistics. I'm recording this call. I lied. The police are listening. He laughed. Actually laughed. No, you're not. And even if you were, I'd just say you edited it, that I was playing along with your delusions to calm you down. It's my word against yours, Sarah, and right now, I'm the concerned husband dealing with a mentally unstable wife. Bill's playing the worried stepfather. You're the paranoid woman holed up in a motel with her kid, making wild accusations. Who do you think people are going to believe? He was right, and we both knew it. The story he could tell, that I'd become increasingly erratic, that I'd misunderstood innocent situations, that I'd fled with Jake in some kind of psychotic break, was more believable than the truth. Because the truth sounded like a bad thriller, like something that doesn't happen to real people in real life. What happens now? I asked quietly.
Now?
Now you can stay gone. I'll file for divorce, cite abandonment, and mental instability. I'll get custody of Jake, because you're clearly not fit to care for him. I'll sell the house, split it with Bill, and we'll all move on with our lives. You can live in motel rooms and look over your shoulder forever, or you can be reasonable and come to some kind of arrangement. An arrangement? Supervised visitation with Jake. A small settlement to help you get back on your feet. All you have to do is admit you overreacted, apologize to Bill for the false accusations, and agree to the divorce terms. We can make this easy, Sarah. Or we can make it very, very hard. I looked at Jake, still coloring, still innocent, still small enough to believe that adults are fundamentally good, and that home is the safest place in the world. I'm not giving you my son, I said. Then I guess it's going to be hard, Mark replied and hung up. For a moment, I just sat there, the dead phone in my hand, trying to process the enormity of what my life had become. 48 hours ago, I'd been a normal person with normal problems, a mortgage, a job, a husband who traveled too much, a stepfather I tolerated rather than loved. Now I was a woman whose husband had tried to have her killed, whose own family had turned into a conspiracy, whose entire life had been a lie she'd been too trusting to see. But I had something they didn't expect. I had a 7-year-old boy who'd heard something he shouldn't have and had the courage to speak up. I had camera footage they didn't know existed. And I had the simple, stubborn refusal to die just because it was convenient for someone else's financial planning. Have you ever had to rebuild your entire life from scratch? If you're still watching, drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what you would have done. Because what I did next required more courage than I knew I had. I went to see a lawyer the next morning. Not a family lawyer like Officer Rodriguez had suggested, but a criminal defense attorney named Patricia Chun who'd been recommended by a friend of a friend. Her office was downtown, small and cramped, decorated with diplomas and case plaques that suggested she'd spent her career defending people everyone else had written off. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression never changing. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with dark, intelligent eyes. Mrs. Garrett, I'm going to tell you the same thing the police probably did. What you have is highly suspicious, but ultimately circumstantial. However, there are some things we can do to protect you and build a case. Like what? First, we file for an emergency protective order against both your husband and stepfather. We use the camera footage and the fake Seattle trip as evidence of potential danger. It probably won't be granted, but it creates a paper trail. Second, we hire a private investigator to dig into both men's finances, their recent activity, their communications. If they're planning something, there will be more evidence somewhere. Third, we file for divorce immediately and request full custody. We flip the script. You're not the unstable one fleeing. You're the protective mother removing your child from danger. Will any of that work? She smiled grimly. That depends on what the investigator finds. But in the meantime, it makes you look proactive and rational rather than paranoid and reactive. It changes the narrative. I hired her on the spot, draining my personal savings account to pay her retainer. The private investigator she recommended, a former cop named Tom Chun, no relation, started working that afternoon. The protective order hearing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, I did what Officer Rodriguez had suggested. I stayed away, I documented everything, and I waited. The investigator called 3 days later. Mrs. Garrett, I need you to sit down for this. I was already sitting in the same motel room where I'd been living, eating takeout and helping Jake with homework and trying to pretend this was an adventure rather than a nightmare. I found communications between your husband and stepfather going back 6 months. Emails, text messages, even phone records. They were sloppy, used personal accounts, didn't delete things properly. It's all there. The plan, the timeline, even the guy they hired to do it. His name's Ray Kowalski, career criminal with assault priors. They paid him $5,000 up front with another $5,000 promised after the job was done. My hands started shaking. That's evidence. Real evidence. It gets better. Or worse, depending on your perspective. Your stepfather took out a separate life insurance policy on you 6 months ago. You're listed as his stepdaughter, which apparently makes it legal in this state, though deeply unethical. $500,000, with him as the beneficiary. He didn't need your signature, just proof of insurable interest, which your relationship provided. So, he was going to profit even more than I thought. And there's money missing from your stepfather's accounts. $20,000 withdrawn in cash over the past 3 months. When I talked to some of his neighbors, they mention a younger woman he's been seeing, someone he met online who supposedly lives in Costa Rica. He's been planning to move there. Bought a property 6 weeks ago. The picture was complete now, painted in broad strokes of greed and selfishness and casual cruelty. Mark wanted out of his debts and his marriage. Bill wanted his money back and a new life abroad. I was the solution to both their problems, nothing more than a financial obstacle to be removed. Is this enough? I asked. For the police? It's enough for an arrest. I'm sending everything to Detective Rodriguez right now. She'll need to verify it through proper channels, but Mrs. Garrett, this is slam-dunk evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. Your husband and stepfather are going to jail. I should have felt relieved. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I just felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left only the shell. The man I'd married, the man I'd trusted with my life and my child's life, had calculated my worth in dollars and decided I was worth more dead. The stepfather who'd been at my wedding, who'd held Jake as a baby, who'd sat at our dinner table and smiled and pretended to care, had seen me as nothing more than a paycheck he could cash in with enough planning and patience. If you've made it this far in the story, I want you to understand something. This didn't happen because I was stupid or naive or blind. It happened because I trusted people who wore the mask of family so convincingly that I never thought to look underneath. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because the ending of this story is going to teach you exactly what those masks look like when they finally come off. The arrests happened fast once Rodriguez had the evidence. Mark was picked up at a casino in Atlantic City, just like I'd suspected, establishing his alibi for a murder that never happened. Bill was arrested at his house, probably packing for his new life in Costa Rica with money that was supposed to come from my death. Ray Kowalski, the man they'd hired to kill me, was arrested at a motel 3 miles from my house. The news coverage was immediate and intense. Local reporters loved the story. Suburban mom escapes murder plot. 7-year-old son's warning saves both their lives. Our house was on every evening news broadcast, our street filled with cameras and reporters asking neighbors if they'd suspected anything, if there had been warning signs, if they felt safe knowing this had almost happened right next door. I watched it all from Patricia Chen's office, Jake beside me drawing pictures while the adults talked about trials and testimony and protective custody. He still didn't fully understand what had happened, just that Daddy and Grandpa Bill had done something very bad, and we couldn't see them anymore. Sometimes that's a blessing, that childhood inability to grasp the full scope of adult evil. The trial took 8 months. I testified for 3 days, walking the jury through every detail, the parking lot conversation, the motel room, the camera footage, the canceled conference, the property deed, everything. Mark's lawyer tried to paint me as paranoid, tried to suggest that the emails and texts were taken out of context, that this was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by an unstable woman. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecutor was a sharp woman named Amanda Reeves who'd built her career on domestic violence cases. She presented everything methodically, building a timeline that left no room for doubt. She brought in financial experts who explained the money trail, digital forensic specialists who verified the emails and texts, even Ray Kowalski himself, who'd taken a plea deal in exchange for testimony. He told the jury exactly what he'd been hired to do. break in through the back door at midnight, make it look like a burglary, and if anyone got in the way, meaning me, use whatever force was necessary. He described it clinically, like he was explaining how to change a tire, and I watched the jury's faces change as they understood what had almost happened to me and my son. Mark took the stand in his own defense. He denied everything, claimed the emails were fabricated, that Bill had acted alone, that he'd known nothing about any plan. But under cross-examination, Amanda dismantled him piece by piece. She showed him his own words, his own planning, his own calculations about insurance money and property values. She asked him to explain the fake Seattle trip, the property deed he'd hidden from me, the 20 phone calls to Bill in the weeks leading up to that night. By the end, even his own lawyer looked like he didn't believe him. Bill didn't testify. His lawyer advised against it, probably because there was no version of events where Bill came out looking like anything other than what he was. A man who'd seen his stepdaughter as a financial asset to be liquidated when convenient. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, the forewoman read the verdicts in a steady voice that didn't waver. Conspiracy to commit murder. Attempted murder. Fraud. Solicitation of murder. Guilty on all counts for both Mark and Bill. Mark got 25 years to life. Bill got 20 years. Ray Kowalski got 15 with his plea deal. The judge, a grandmother with steel gray hair and reading glasses on a chain, looked at all three of them before sentencing and said something I'll never forget. You conspired to murder a wife, a mother, a daughter, as if her life was nothing more than a transaction to be completed. You betrayed every bond of trust and family, and you did it with calculation and patience that speaks to a profound moral emptiness. I hope you use your time in prison to reflect on the enormity of what you attempted, and I hope Mrs. Garrett finds peace knowing that justice has been served. I did find peace, eventually, though it took time and therapy and countless nights lying awake wondering how I'd missed the signs, how I'd been so wrong about the people closest to me. Jake and I moved across the country, to a small town where nobody knew our story, where we could start over without the weight of everyone knowing we were the mother and son from the news, the ones who'd almost been murdered. He's 15 now, tall and thoughtful, with the same old soul eyes that saved our lives in an airport parking lot 8 years ago. He doesn't remember most of it, or at least he says he doesn't, though sometimes I catch him looking at me with an expression that suggests he remembers more than he lets on. We talk about it sometimes on the hard days, when the anniversary comes around, or when he asks questions about his father or why some families break in ways that can't be fixed. I tell him the truth, age-appropriate versions that grow more detailed as he gets older. I tell him that sometimes people make terrible choices, that love and family don't always mean what we think they mean, and that the bravest thing he ever did was trust his instinct and speak up when something felt wrong. The house was sold eventually, split between the state and the Victims' Compensation Fund. I got a small settlement after years of legal wrangling, enough to put toward Jake's college fund and our fresh start. The insurance policies were voided due to the criminal activity. Bill's Costa Rica property was seized and sold. Everything they'd planned, everything they'd schemed for, dissolved into nothing but prison sentences and legal fees. I rebuilt my life slowly, deliberately, with walls around my trust that took years for anyone to climb. I dated eventually, though it took 5 years before I could even consider it, and 7 before I introduced anyone to Jake. I married again last year, to a patient man named David who knows my whole story and has never once made me feel like I was damaged or paranoid for being cautious. We have security cameras in our house, more than necessary probably, but David understands why I need them. We have deadbolts and alarm systems and a dog that barks at strangers. And every time someone asks for a key or wants to stop by when we're not home, I feel that old fear creep up my spine, that whisper of doubt that maybe, just maybe, I'm wrong about who I can trust. But I'm also stronger now. I know what I'm capable of, the courage it takes to choose safety over social norms, to trust a child's warning over adult assurances, to stand up in court and tell a room full of strangers about the worst moments of your life. I know that survival isn't always about fighting back. Sometimes it's about listening to the quiet voice that says something's wrong, even when you can't explain why, even when everyone else says you're overreacting. If you watched this entire story, I want to thank you. I want you to know that I'm sharing this not for sympathy or attention, but because I believe these stories need to be told. We need to talk about the warning signs we ignore, the family members we trust blindly, the instincts we dismiss as paranoia. We need to teach our children that it's okay to speak up when something feels wrong, even if they can't articulate why, even if they're talking about adults they're supposed to respect. Jake saved my life that night in the airport parking lot. Not because he understood the full scope of danger, but because he trusted his gut, and I trusted him enough to listen. That's the real lesson here. Not that everyone is secretly plotting against you, but that your instincts exist for a reason, and sometimes the smallest voice carries the most important warning. So here's what I want you to do. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And then I want you to think about your own life, your own relationships, your own inner voice. Are there things you've been dismissing? Concerns you've been talking yourself out of? People who have more access to your life than they should? I'm not saying everyone is dangerous. I'm not saying trust no one. But I am saying that trust should be earned and verified, that family doesn't automatically mean safety, and that you should never, ever ignore that feeling in your gut that says something isn't right. Comment below and tell me about a time you trusted your instinct. Tell me about a warning sign you caught or one you wish you hadn't ignored. Let's build a community where we talk about these things honestly, where we share our stories and learn from each other, where we remind each other that it's okay to be cautious, to ask questions, to demand explanations, to prioritize safety over politeness. Because at the end of the day, your life is worth more than someone else's comfort. Your safety matters more than appearing reasonable or trusting or easygoing. And if my story teaches you anything, let it teach you that. Jake and I are okay now. We're more than okay. We're happy. We're healing. We're building a life that's ours and nobody else's. We have movie nights and inside jokes and a future that almost didn't exist. And every single day, I'm grateful for that moment in the parking lot when he looked up at me with those old soul eyes and said the words that changed everything. We can't go home tonight. Trust your children. Trust your instincts. Trust yourself. And never let anyone convince you that your survival instinct is an overreaction. Thank you for watching this entire story. You've spent this time with me, walking through the worst and best moments of my life, and I hope it meant something. I hope it made you think.
I hope it might even save someone someday.
Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, you're worth fighting for. Always.